How you guys doing today? I don't come in this room too often. I try to avoid coming in here. I think I'm a little bit traumatized from my days as an APD back in the good old days in the early part of this century with me, Dr. Gernsheimer, and a young Jimmy Willis, who was a medical student, a young Dr. Jane Kim, who was my medical student who I met my first day as an attending. The only people who were here that in this room, right? Actually, no, Silberg's not here because he's avoiding being in conference because he's also traumatized from being a residency director. But I'm really excited to be back here and talk to you guys. I want to say what's up to the old folks in the back. You got the peanut gallery, the new third years who all kind of cluster together. They don't want to associate with the newbies, but I want to welcome all the new people in the front who didn't know any better and decided to come up front because Dr. Willis probably told them that they needed to come up and sit up front and make sure that they made their presence known. But I want to say welcome to you all. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey. I've been at Kings County for 19 years, which is really hard to say because it makes me feel really old and ancient when I say that. But it's been 19 years working on both sides of the street. But right now, I'm only on the county side. Um, Before I start, there's some things I want to disclose. The first thing is some of the images that you're going to see in today's talk might be triggering. So if you want to step outside, if you got to put your head down, if you want to talk about some of the stuff after, we can really have a more of an in-depth discussion. But I completely understand. I don't know the traumas that you've been through, and some of the stuff may actually be upsetting. Number two, I have a book called Treating Violence, which is out on Beacon Press. Some of you all have copies of the book. Hopefully, all of you guys will get copies of the book at some point in time, but we can talk about that later. And last but not least, I'm on the board of directors of an organization that I founded called CAVI, which is the Kings Against Violence Initiative. CAVI is a hospital, school, and community-based violence intervention and prevention program. And so a lot of my views are going to reflect this window that I've been looking through to understand violence and trauma. But it's kind of impossible to really go over this whole concept of violence and trauma without really understanding one key concept, and that's the concept of power. This is a sociologist named Wade Nobles, and Wade Nobles said that power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definitions as if it were their own. The system of government known as apartheid, where you have a minority exogenous group misappropriating power to ensure the social, economic, and political dominance over indigenous people. Old school hip hop artist and tech entrepreneur Nas once rapped, "It's that shit that moves crowds, making every ghetto foul. I might have took your first child, scarred your life, crippled your style. I gave you power. I made you buck wild." Nas talked about the power that came from a gun. And people have been fearful of power for a long time and with good reason. Those in positions.
This happens.
No. It's supposed to be.
Oh,
No, I blacked it. I want you to pay attention to me. That's why. People have been fearful of power for a long time and with good reason. Those in positions of power have a fear it's going to be taken away from them. Those not in power have a fear it's going to be exercised on them for not having power in the first place. This power is about control. Power is hierarchy. Power can instill fear. Power can instill dominance. But when power affects every aspect of your life, then its absence or its presence can lead to conflict, and that conflict can lead to violence. When I was a medical student in the good old days of SUNY Buffalo, I know we have a couple of Buffalo people here. That's me. If you can't tell, I'm the only Black person in this picture. Not much has changed. And well, actually, no, Nate and Gibson, they weren't the only ones in their class, but there are a few. When I was a medical student, I had no interest in doing violence intervention work. I wanted to do global health. This is actually one of my good buddies who is a global health physician, Dr. Charmaine Gregory. She works in Guam. So that's another option for some of you people who don't like to be in this cold climate. You can move out of this country. But I had no interest in doing this. I wanted to do global health. I was about to do a global health fellowship, but there were some things that started taking place when I was in residency that made me want to shift. I would eventually come back to doing a lot of the global health work, with most of the work focusing in Haiti, where we were training drivers and laborers in first aid and emergency response, really building capacity. But that did have an impact on what I want to do, but I had to focus on some things that were taking place back home here in the United States. I did residency in Cook County Hospital. I'm actually fortunate. I did part of my residency in the old Cook County Hospital, which has now been turned into a hotel, which is really crazy. The new Cook County is right around the corner from there. We have a couple of people from the Midwest, right? Where the Chicago folks at? They didn't come. I mean, I'm gonna get. Oh no, Caleb's back there. I see you. You can't go hide, brother. Don't hide. You got to be proud. The Midwest is a very special place. They got special people. My family's actually from there, even though I was raised in Brooklyn. My family's actually from Chicago, and my dad grew up on the west side of Chicago and was born at Cook County Hospital. But the Midwest is a very interesting place because it's this land of extremes. In the wintertime, you've got sub-zero temperatures, which is the norm. But in the summertime, things are a little bit different, and it's exceptionally hot. And those hottest days of the summer tend to be the most violent. This particular day when I was in residency, it was August of 2005. And usually around that time, you're talking about 105 degrees on an ongoing basis. And the further you move away from Lake Michigan, the hotter it gets. The hotter it gets, people get more agitated. Part of that might be due to some aggression theories tied to heat, where if you're close up top on top of people, people don't want to be near you. They're agitated and they're upset, and so it increases the rates of violence. But these hottest days of the summer are the most violent. And on this day when I was on call in our trauma emergency department, it was different. It was in the 50s, and it was cold, and it was raining, and I was going to be there for a 24-hour period. I was really fine with sitting there doing nothing because I was a chief resident and I had a ton of paperwork to do. But one of my co-residents shouted out and said that he was bored. And you know what happens when people start using those words. And at the time, we just had a bunch of blunt trauma patients coming in. Cook County Hospital sits very close to the Dan Ryan Highway, so you get a lot of MVAs coming from that area, and people just drive a little bit even more crazy there than they do here, which is hard to even fathom. But he said that he was bored, and a bunch of other people around the room in the trauma ER said, "Yes, we're bored." And then he proceeded to say, "I hope something exciting comes in." And then a bunch of other people in the room say, "Yeah, herd mentality being what it is." They say, "Yeah, we want something exciting coming in," because excitement means trauma. Excitement means penetrating trauma. Excitement for the surgery residents that were part of our team meant they got to go to the operating room. Excitement for the EM folks on the team means you get to sew up faces. You get to sew up a $150 scar. You get to put in a chest tube. You get to intubate. You get to do a thoracotomy. And unfortunately, thoracotomies were very common on the west side of Chicago. But excitement also meant you have another young Black or Latinx male who's coming in as a victim and survivor of violence. And I'm looking around the room, and the only two people of color in that room who were working were me and one of the clerks. The other people of color were the patients. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, damn, I live on the south side of Chicago. A lot of the patients at Cook County came from the south side of Chicago. So if I'm in the wrong place and wrong time, my co-resident is going to be excited that I'm coming in. My cousins lived on the west side of Chicago. A lot of the patients, matter of fact, most of the patients at Cook County Hospital come from the west side of Chicago. So I'm always wondering if they come in the wrong place, wrong time, my co-resident is going to be excited. And I got to thinking, it's like, as an EM physician, as a budding emergentologist, it's important for us to really understand how to master these traumatic resuscitation skills. But I had this idea. I said, what would happen if we made sure that people didn't have to become patients? So I started studying the work of Dr. John Rich and Dr. Arthur Kellerman. Those are the first two docs I'd ever heard about who talked about violence and trauma as a public health issue, meaning if you understand the risk factors and if you intervene with these risk factors, you can really change the course of this disease process like any other infectious disease. And so my senior grand rounds wound up being about youth violence. And, when you start doing research and stuff, all these different ideas come up. And I'm doing internet searches, I'm searching through papers, I'm reading through books, but once you look up one thing, other things pop up. And there's this thing that came up, and I was like, what does it mean to be human? And so I started doing even more deep dives into that. Who are we? What makes us tick? What makes us thrive? What makes us be able to coexist and live in certain communities? And there were three key things that came up. One, there has to be balance amongst the members of the community. Number two, there has to be a synergistic relationship amongst the people in the community. And number three, there has to be mutual respect amongst people in the community. But things are good until they're not. We've all been in conflict before, right? Which is any kind of major argument and disagreement. How many of you all are married in here? I know we have one happy couple in the back, the residents, and you all know what kind of conflicts happen when you put the toilet paper in backwards, or you don't put the toilet paper in. You might have a rude awakening if you sit down or stand up, depending on your preferred method of relieving yourself. If you live in, you eat your roommate or you eat your partner's leftover food, you can have a major issue. And these are minor conflicts, but when you live in these close quarters, this can be a major thing, forcing you to sleep on the couch, or even some cases seeking another roommate. Now, hey, you all are laughing. I know some of you all moved out from multiple people in this room. So we're being very real, and y'all know who I'm talking about. But anytime you're in a place where you have those who have and those who have not, you're going to wind up having conflict. When there's this threat of scarcity, particularly when you have a group that's living in close demarcation, you have this sharp demarcation between the haves and the have-nots, conflict is going to happen. If you wind up having one group who has access to power and they know that they've used that power, they can protect their people, But they also know that they can ensure dominance over other people. You're going to wind up having conflicts that are occurring. Right now, you got about 56% of the world's population that lives in a city. That means you got a lot of mofos standing on top of each other. In another 25 years, you're going to have 68% of the world's population living in urban centers. This means more people who are going to be sharing resources, more land scarcity, more people living close to each other means the increased risk of spreading infectious diseases and increasing the risk of conflict. According to the United Nations, there are specific rights that are inherent to all living beings on this planet, regardless of their age, their geographic location, their ethnic differences, their economic status, or their sexual orientation. These 30 rights are referred to as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is kind of almost a blueprint to help promote peace and prosperity, at least in theory. Some of these rights that we're familiar with are the right, the freedom of expression, the right to be free from torture, and the right to life. But what happens if your right is actually taken away from you? The late Dr. Paul Farmer, and Paul Farmer was an amazing global health doc. He founded Partners in Health, but he said that human rights violations aren't accidents. They're not random in distribution or effect. Rights violations are rather symptoms of deeper pathologies of power that are linked intimately to the social conditions that determine who will suffer from abuse and who will be shielded from harm. We see this right to life being threatened every day in our emergency department as the right to life is threatened or challenged. And it might be because of some sort of disease process or an illness. This is a patient who's actually dying from silicosis. He worked in gold mines in China. Sometimes that right to life might be because of an accident or an injury. And when we wind up having injury brought onto living tissue from some sort of external force, we call that trauma. Now, when the act of trauma itself is deliberate, when the act itself has been really determined to cause some sort of harm, to injure, or even to kill, we call that violence. This is a patient we actually took care of in a CCT. He walked out of the emergency department the next day. He was a treat and release. He wound up having GSWs across the right anterior portion of the chest, went through the right upper extremity, and yeah, he survived. Luckily, it didn't hit anything. And I told him kind of the work that we were doing with CAVI and violence intervention, and I asked if I could take a picture of him and use it for our discussions. He drove to the hospital himself. His SUV was sprayed up, and he dropped himself off in front of Kings County and walked into the emergency department. So some of these resuscitations, I know we talk about this stuff on, people see it on TV, and some of the old heads, the gray hairs and no hairs in this room actually talk about the kind of traumas that we saw back in the old days. This stuff is actually very real. But violence itself is something that happens all around the planet. You have close to 500,000 homicides that occur every year around the world. And this does not include those people who are lost as casualties to war. The darker the larger the diamonds that are here on this map, those are the greater the homicide rates. Right now, you got about 8.2 billion people around the world that live here. About 2.4 billion of the people around the world are kids. Every year, you have at least 1 billion children who are impacted by violence. That's physical violence, sexual violence, or even psychosocial violence. But we don't even have to look around the world. You can look right here in the United States. Right now, homicide is the number 3 cause of death for U.S. youth ages 15 to 24. It's the number 2 cause of death for Black women ages 15 to 24. It's the number 2 cause of death for Latinx males ages 15 to 34, but it's the number 1 cause of death for Black men ages 15 to 34. This is a problem. When I started doing this work, I was more likely to die from homicide than I was from any other process around the planet. And so this is part of the reason why, some of it was more self-preservation why I started doing this work. But when you look at all the people who are coming in, who are victims and survivors, you go, why does this keep happening? And I grew up here. And I went to PS 235, right across the street from the parking deck at Kings County. So a lot of the people that we treat here are people that I know that I'm somehow connected to, whether it's their friends, their family. And for those of us who are from Brooklyn, there are a couple of people who were born in Kings County Hospital. We know how in close proximity this stuff really gets. So we want to make sure that we become very careful of the language that we use when we describe some of the traumas that we're experiencing. There's a sociologist named Johann Galtung who actually died about a year ago, and he described violence as having 3 different components. He likened it to that of like an iceberg. And you've got the stuff that you can see, and then there's the stuff that you can't see. The stuff that you can't see, that's the part that took out the Titanic, right? At the top of this iceberg, you got direct violence. Direct violence refers to the overt acts of violence. These are the physical assaults. These are the verbal threats. This is all the stuff that we see in the CCT. And this type of violence differs from other parts because there's a specific player who's involved. That player might be an individual who's the perpetrator, might be a group of people, it could be a gang, it could be an army, but it's linked to a specific perpetrator who's causing that act itself. And then right below the surface, you've got cultural violence, because it's always that stuff that you can't see that causes a lot of harm. And cultural violence, when we say culture, we talk about anything focusing on language, language, ideologies, art, religion, science, that's used to justify both direct violence as well as structural violence. That can cause some sort of harm. And this is like when you have a group who uses religious references to justify ill treatment of members of the LGBTQIA plus community. This is also like when you have a group of people refer to another group as vermin or as untouchable. These are cultural practices. But the whole purpose is to really cause a person to be seen, to dehumanize them. If somebody's not considered human, they're not valuable. They're not valuable, that means they're expendable. And then right at the bottom of this iceberg, you've got structural violence. And structural violence refers to the systematic ways that social structures like government or any kind of institution causes harm by prohibiting the flow of things that are essential for the survivability of the people. Like when you restrict healthcare, when you restrict education resources, when you restrict economic resources, legal rights or legal representation, political rights, this causes harm. But all of us wind up focusing on the direct violence because we see it. And with structural violence, there's no specific player who's involved, so we ignore it. Why do we even care about doing this stuff? Yes, we're emergency physicians or emergency physicians in training, and we're going to see a lot of this stuff in the CCT and even sometimes not in the CCT. Some of you all live in Crown Heights, East New York. You're going to see this stuff on the streets or where you live. But there's a philosopher named George Santayana, and he said it best. He said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Violence is cyclical. Violence is repetitive. When you have somebody who comes in who's been shot or stabbed, that rate of re-injuries is between 8 and 58% within 5 years of that initial injury. The rate of them being killed is as high as 20% within 5 years after that initial injury. Each subsequent injury increases that rate. On top of that, it costs a whole lot of money. You have somebody who comes in who's a treat and release and who has a minor trauma. It's going to cost you easily $1,000, $2,000 for that ER visit. Somebody winds up dying in the emergency department after traumatic resuscitation. You're talking about $5,000 plus for that trauma, the cost of that trauma resuscitation. And we're not even talking about somebody who we were able to keep alive. If somebody gets hospitalized, that can cost you up to $25,000 plus for that hospitalization period. This is the cost related to the medical fees, the surgical costs, the blood transfusion, the medications, antibiotics that are received, the rent for the hospital room. Those are the direct costs of violence. When we start looking at the direct costs, as well as the indirect costs overall around the United States, this costs over $30 billion per year. And some of the indirect costs we might not even consider are the people who can't work anymore, so you lose your ability to make money. Those are wages that are lost for people who live in communities that are plagued by violence. You're going to have property values that are going to wind up decreasing because of that. Businesses starting to shut down. You start looking at certain parts of New York City, East New York, this whole central Brooklyn area. You've got business districts, but you have some business districts that used to be thriving back in the 60s and 70s, but they're no longer thriving. They've been shut down because of urban violence, and so people don't want to invest in these communities. When I first started doing this work, this is one of the first papers I came across. It's called Pathways to Recurrent Trauma Amongst Young Black Men. It was written by Dr. John Rich. Dr. Rich is now at Rush University. He's one of the disparities centers, but he founded a program called Healing Hurt People, which is based in Philadelphia and in Chicago. And he did a qualitative analysis looking at the narratives of young Black men who've been affected by violence and trauma in the Boston area. And there are three key things that came up that were very common in this in his research. The first thing was traumatic stress, which we know as acute stress disorder or PTSD. The other one was called lack of faith in the police. Myself, I've had major issues with police. I've talked about it in the book. I'm not a big fan of policing as it relates to NYPD, and I have my reasons. We can talk about that a little bit later. But when you don't feel safe, when your law enforcement, the people who are supposed to protect and serve, when they aren't doing that job, and you feel threatened, you as a member of the community wants to take matters into your own hands, which sets you up for additional opportunities to engage in some sort of violence. And the last one that they talked about was loss of respect. And loss of respect falls under the tenets of the code of the street. The code of the street, according to Philadelphia sociologist named Elijah Anderson, is defined as a set of informal rules which govern interpersonal public behavior, particularly violence. So if somebody attacks you physically, verbally, Psychologically, you got to be aggressive. If you don't respond aggressive, they're going to look at you as a punk. And there's some other adjectives that we like to use in certain scenarios. But if you don't respond a certain way, that means you're going to tolerate victimization. And if you tolerate victimization, that means you're going to be set up for other opportunities to be taken advantage of. So you have to have that face. You've got to have that aggression when you walk outside of these spaces or walk into these spaces. In addition to the physical injuries that we see, that we take care of. This is a young man who actually survived. He's got a $150 scar. We say a $150 scar because you've got at least 150 sutures that we say it takes to close it up. If you notice, trying to figure out what that tube is in his mouth, that's a syringe that's hooked up to an angiocatheter. We inserted the angiocatheter into the parotid duct and to squirt saline to see if the parotid duct was actually patent. And that's going to determine if he needs to go to the OR for operative repair. He was actually sliced with a razor blade. I know everybody makes a big stink about GSWs and stuff like that. The reason why I stopped talking about gun violence specifically is because I've had close friends of me who were killed because they were sliced, they were cut up. This disfiguring thing right here sends a message to somebody who's been injured. It sends a message to everybody on the street that goes, okay, he was a snitch. He was involved in something. I want to make sure that everywhere you go, you are constantly reminded of what you did and who you are. And so you're wind up being marked for life. But yet we always like to pay attention to GSWs. I'm not a fan of the whole Gun Violence Awareness Month because it just pushes all this other stuff aside. So I want you to think about when we have patients who are coming in, no matter what the injury is, if they were assaulted, consider it this. It's important. Don't just say, oh, because it's not a GSW, I can brush this person away. He did well after the procedure. Now, other things that patients who experience violence, they have the physical wounds. That stuff is really uncomfortable. One of the main things they experience, which some of the stuff that you guys experienced on this first day at work, they experience stress, right? So, stress itself is a normal response within the human body. That's part of our sympathetic nervous system. It's supposed to keep us free from some sort of inherent danger. When you have this some sort of threat that presents itself, you've got something like a saber-toothed tiger is chasing you, and thinking about prehistoric times, and then you've got stress hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol that give us that kick that we need to get out of harm's reach. The problem is not that initial stressor. The problem is when that stress response keeps happening over and over again without rest, without proper recovery, it becomes pathologic and toxic, and it impacts both our physical health as well as our psychological health. The body itself is a miraculous vessel, but the problem is we like to be comfortable. We like to stay the same. We like to have that inner balance. That inner balance is what we refer to as homeostasis. But because of the dynamics of the human body, we can adapt to stressors and changes. That process of adaptation to stressors is what's referred to as allostasis. It's what me and Ari and Dina do all the time when we're in jujitsu. We get placed in these harsh situations in jujitsu where some big 200-pound person is trying to crush your bones and you're trying to figure out how do I adapt to it. The good news is after 5 minutes, your round is over and you can rest, you can recover. That's a really important thing. The problem is when you don't have that rest and recovery period. So when that happens, that's what we refer to as allostatic load. That's what causes our immune systems to break down, our physical body starts to break down, and other complications related to stress. We've all been stressed before, right? How many you got new third years in the back who are excited and terrified at the same time of becoming senior residents because they know that first CCT shift with me on a 3 to 11. On a 3 to 11, you got all those psych patients. It's the first of the month on top of that. And everybody's got their liquor and they got their drugs up in them and they run around butt naked and you're trying to manage them on top of the other traumas. And it gets real. And what happens? You go through a stressful experience, right? You got headache, heart palpitations, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Sounds like COVID. Sounds like your first day of residency. Sounds like your first month and a half, 2 years as an attending, right? Adrian will vouch. You know what I'm talking about. But the stress response is really a part of a spectrum. And you're supposed to have a stress response within 0 to 3 days after being presented with some sort of triggering event. But there's some symptoms that actually happen after 3 days and after about a month. 0 to 3 days, it's normal to have the stress response. Just remember that. And I bring this up because a lot of our patients who are in CCT, in the main ER, they're freaking out. You're like, man, why are you acting up? I already told you you don't have this injury, but you don't know what's actually happening to them. If you're in that space and that's the same place where your mom was pronounced dead, the same place where you were shot last time, that could be a triggering event. If you lost a number of other people due to some sort of violence or trauma, that might be a triggering event. And it's normal for somebody who's been in any kind of accident or injury to have a trauma response after, between 3 days. Once it goes beyond 3 days, when it goes between 3 days and 4 weeks, we refer to that as acute stress disorder. And those patients who have acute stress disorder are going to wind up having, you'll see that at least with like 5 to 25% of your patients who've experienced any kind of trauma, and it does increase the risk of them developing PTSD. Now, when you have these symptoms that we described a little bit earlier, based on that same triggering event, not a different triggering event, but the same triggering event when it lasts beyond 4 weeks, that's what we refer to as PTSD. About 10% of people who experience any kind of trauma are going to go on and develop PTSD. That rate jumps up to 20% when that trauma was due to an assault. That rate jumps up to more than 50% when that assault was due to sexual violence. And so it's important that we pay attention to some of the nonverbal cues that our patients present with, because we don't know what can be triggering to them and lead to some other complications. There's a relatively new-ish ICD-11 diagnosis, and that's called complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is very similar to regular PTSD in the sense that people are going to have the sensation of reliving the trauma that they've experienced. They're going to also do anything to avoid experiencing those symptoms, and they also have the sensation of having this looming threat that's hanging above. It differs from regular PTSD in the sense that the trauma that they're experiencing is prolonged and repetitive. So this is the trauma that you're going to see when people have experienced war. This is the trauma that you're going to see with people who have experienced repeated sexual violence or repeated intimate partner violence. These are actually people who were people who were evacuating Rwanda after the Rwandanese genocide that took place in the 90s. On top of that, the patients who experience complex PTSD are going to have some of the regular symptoms that you'll see with PTSD, but they're going to have feelings of worthlessness. They're going to have feelings of shame. They're going to have a lot of feelings of guilt. They have major problems developing and maintaining relationships, and they wind up coming back to the ER repetitively for some of these symptoms. These are a lot of patients that may present with these symptoms that we don't like to take care of because sometimes we think that they're annoying. But a lot of patients aren't going to tell you the traumas that they've experienced. They're just going to act out on this behavior. And so it's important we pay attention to the nonverbal cues. I know we're trying to get those notes done. And for the interns and the junior residents, it takes a long ass time to write these notes. But pay attention to your patients. The reason why I always ask the patients, and some of the residents roll their eyes, I'm like, okay, what does a patient do for a living? Who lives with them? Where are they from? And they go, they do, you know how people roll their eyes. But all this stuff gives you major insights into what's going to be, how the person's going to be cared for, and their support system that they're going to have access to once they leave the ER. So you have to pay attention to those symptoms. Who knows who this is right here? Right, nobody. You're like, okay, who's this random white-haired dude? This is Dr. Vincent Folletti. And in 1998, he published a study. He was looking to see if there's any kind of correlations between trauma during childhood and health outcomes as adults. He called the study ACEs, which is also known as adverse childhood experiences. And any adverse childhood experience is an event that takes place under the age of 18 that can cause harm. This is anything from physical abuse, sexual abuse. This is physical neglect. This is living in the house with somebody who's justice impacted. And we use that term justice impacted because that's somebody we use that instead of saying the person is incarcerated. But even just living in the house with somebody who's incarcerated is considered an adverse event. If you live in the household with somebody who has some sort of mental illness or mental health challenge, that is an adverse childhood event. Right now, about 60% of people in the United States have at least one adverse childhood experience. More than 80% of people who were justice impacted are going to have one or more adverse childhood experience. More than 40% of people who are justice impacted are going to have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. The greater the number of adverse childhood experiences, the greater the amount of greater the increase of certain problems related to endocrine problems, increased risk of autoimmune problems, increased risk in cardiovascular problems, increased risk of entering the justice system, increased risk of dying because of trauma. This is a major issue. We also tend to see elevated levels of adverse childhood experiences in very vulnerable populations. So if you look at individuals who are Black, Latinx, members of LGBTQIA plus community, multiracial communities, not everybody likes to hear them. Not everybody likes to listen to them. And so because of that, these stresses and traumas and triggers continue to go on until it becomes pathologic and toxic. That's what we referred to before earlier as allostatic load. The good news is when you have positive childhood experience, adverse childhood experience, and people who experience positive childhood experiences, it can have a protective factor. And a positive childhood experience can be anything from having a positive family foundation, having family resilience, being a part of a supportive school and community environment. People who have these positive childhood experiences, particularly adverse childhood experience patients, have lowered rates of adulthood depression. Good news is there are some things that also help. Addressing our social determinants of health can be very protective when we start looking at violence and trauma, because these gives us, when we start to address some of these individual needs, it gives us the things that are essential for our survivability. When we provide access to education, resources, healthcare, when you have a viable economic system in your community, that means the members of your community can make a proper living wage so they can take care of their family. They can take care of their family. They're not entering an illicit economy and doing some things that may force them to enter the justice system or be injured due to violence. And the social determinants of health, these are the non-medical things that impact our health and well-being. So you screen for them. Social support systems, that's a huge thing. I ask the residents all the time, I ask you all, who's the patient going home with? Because I want to make sure that they don't come back. If we don't, I had an attending at Cook, he said, the longer they stay, the longer they stay. The more they come back, the more they come back. So you have to consider what's the support system, because if you have somebody, think about what happens when you're traumatized. You're nervous, you're anxious, and your ability to process and synthesize information is lacking. And if you don't have anybody to kind of serve as a conduit or really as an interpreter of what you've experienced in your hospitalization stay, you're not going to follow the treatment modalities that we've recommended as a part of our discharge summary. How many patients we talk to, we ask them, like, oh, do you understand? They go, yeah. And if you ask them, well, what did I just say? I don't know. It happens all the time. So please, I'm pleased, we can't stress, we got to make sure we screen enough for these social determinants, but particularly our social support systems. Now I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a segue, because when I talked to Kelsey, she said we want to make sure we do some motivational stuff for you guys too. And but part of the experience with developing Kavi and developing programs is really kind of a lesson in startup culture and community development, community engagement. And these are things that I would have never learned unless I went through some of these painful growth steps. So I moved back to Brooklyn after, in 2006. I started working July 25th, 2006. I did orientation earlier, but I told them I'm not starting July 3rd. I just finished residency at 8 o'clock on July 1st. I got to move across the country. But I came here in July of 2006, and I told Dr. Lucchese, I told Dr. Renner, and I told the department, I'm going to start a violence intervention program. There was nothing that existed in the entire state of New York. There was nothing that existed in the city of New York. But there's always some sort of roadblock. And I wrote out these protocols. I wrote out a description of what this program was going to be. We called it the VIP program. It was me and Dr. Austin. And VIP stood for Violence Intervention Program. It's a really lame name, but it was more of a placeholder. But we kept talking to different people. Talked to Mayor Eric Adams. Back then, he was a senator. He didn't give us any money, which I'm not, a lot of people aren't surprised about it. I wasn't surprised about it then. I wasn't surprised about it now. We talked to a lot of hospital administrators about, oh, we got this program we're going to develop. It's going to save us money because we're going to help lower rates of recurrent violence. They were like, yo, great idea, no money. And so I got pissed off. And I got pissed off about a lot of different things when I was a residency director. I was pissed off about minority recruitment. I was looking, and Dodie was like, yo, Gore, how come we're not having a lot of students of color? We want to make sure that the residency program reflects the community of Brooklyn. How come they're not coming? So I developed a program called MMSEM, and a number of people who were in our residency program and faculty who participated in MMSEM. Gamillo, that was perfect timing. So Gamillo is a part of MMSEM, and MMSEM is the Minority Medical Student Emergency Medicine Summer Fellowship Program, which is focusing on product development with early exposure to emergency medicine. And one of the first projects that the students in MMSEM were tasked with was they were going to help me with my violence intervention program. It was only me doing this stuff. And when anybody tries to build something by themselves, they're destined to fail because you don't have the capacity to build this stuff. But the students in the program came up with a name called CAVI, which was an acronym for the Kings Against Violence Initiative, but it also is a Sanskrit word that meant thinker, doer, and poet. And so that's how the name CAVI came to be in terms of our program. The great thing with CAVI itself was that I was like, we have this great idea, it's going to save lives, but we had no money. And when you talk to administrators, you talk to your directors, you talk to all these different people, great idea, no money, no money, no money, no money, no money, no money. And it's like, damn. Um, at the time, I was doing a lot of global health work. We were doing the work in Haiti. We were doing a lot of capacity building, and we were doing some fundraising with that because we couldn't rely on downstate to give us the resources to do the global health stuff. I kept applying for grants, kept getting rejected, applied, pitched ideas all around the city, and everybody was like, sorry, but I guess you're gonna have to do this on your own. So I got pissed off. And whenever you're pissed off, I don't want you to just be mad and just pout. You gotta go seek the advice of a sage. And so I decided I was gonna drive over to regular Flatbush. This is East Flatbush. Flatbush is a little bit further down for the people who aren't from here. So I wanted to go see my dad. My dad is an interesting individual. I love him. I talk to him a few times a week. He's got a background in television production and media, but he's also a community organizer, and he's a civil rights activist and was mentored by members of Dr. King's inner circle. He met Dr. King when he was like 15, 16 years old on a retreat in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and he came back home to the west side of Chicago talking about community empowerment, which scared the shit out of my grandparents because that meant he was going to go to jail at some point. But he always looks through these problem solving lens, like, what are you going to do? And so I told him that I got rejected from this umpteenth grant. And he said, and he didn't even look up. He was still reading his newspaper. This is not from that day, but this is not much different from usual days when I talk to him, depending on what he's doing. And he said, why the hell should they give you any money? And I'm like, damn. I was like, it's kind of harsh, right? And he said, you haven't done anything. I was like, oh, even harsher. He said, all you've been doing is talking about the problem. I was like, oh, even harsher. And he was right. All I've been doing was talking about this stuff to academic audiences. He said, here, read these magazines. So he threw two magazines at me. It was Fast Company, and the other one was Incorporated Magazine, which are entrepreneurial magazines. And he said, I want you to read this stuff. He said, I might have some information in there. And when I started reading this, I came across some things called sweat equity. I came across something called MVP, a minimum viable product. When you wind up when you're developing a program, you're looking for investment, you're looking for funding, you're looking for grant, people want to make sure that you have an ability to withstand any kind of storm, especially when the money doesn't come. They want to know your investor, your grant funder, and this is whether you're looking at municipal money, government money, or private money. They want to know, do you have sweat equity? Are you going to stick with this project if the money doesn't come? And the reason why I say when money doesn't come is the money doesn't come, even when you've been granted, given the grant. Government money can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years for you to get it. And so what are you going to do for that product that you have up and running, particularly if it's tied to community engagement? So you've got to think about other things. Also, when you're starting something, we all have these big grandiose ideas of putting an idea together. And we see the end goal of what this product can look like, but we don't really see, you don't have the capacity, you don't have the staff to be able to build something from that framework. And so there's this concept in business called an MVP, which is a minimum viable product. That's the most bare bones, basic thing that you put together. And when you're putting together an MVP, it shouldn't really take you more than 6 weeks to put together. And you go, damn, 6 weeks to put together a program? It's not supposed to look pretty. If you spend an entire year putting a program together and then you go out and test it, and if it sucks, then what? Then you're devastated, right? You want to go back and edit it? No. You want to go back and fix that product, fix that program? No, you want to do it. You get pissed off, and then your project winds up dying out. And the people who don't benefit from your expertise of the program that you hope to implement. And so you got to start basic. With this MVP in mind, we decided to launch Kavi, but we decided to do it doing a volunteer-based model. I was like, I knew how to bring people together. I've been doing this work in Haiti with me and Dr. Bloim and some other team members. We were doing a lot of this stuff with minimal resources, and we created programs that were sustainable. So I said, look, we're going to start with a volunteer-based model, but instead of doing a hospital-based intervention program like we had initially planned, we're going to start in a school. We're going to work with kids who are considered at risk, and we started at Wingate High School's campus. Wait, Dr. D, did you go to Wingate? No, you went to Stuyvesant. You went to Stuyvesant, but you grew up in Crown Heights. You got chased by the folks from Wingate too. I've been chased all over this borough. But people are like, oh my gosh, why would you say something like that? People who grew up in this borough, we've been chased all over this planet. I don't wear boots when I walk in certain neighborhoods because I already knew I was going to be chased on certain times of the day. I wore my Timbs if I was with my parents in a car, not walking down the street. So when I say that, it's a term of endearment, but everybody who's from the different boroughs understands that. Buck knows. She went to junior high school in Bushwick, where I went to. But we started with a school-based initiative because the school itself had a pre-existing infrastructure. Wingate High School had major issues with violence and trauma. And I was kind of coming back to, why do we have to spend all this money to do this programming? What would happen if we made sure that people didn't have to become patients? And we started looking kind of back to all that preventative stuff that I've been looking at early in the early days. In our school program, right now we have a few hundred kids around the borough of Brooklyn, and we have an entire curriculum focusing on mediation, conflict resolution, a lot of restorative justice practices and stuff that we go over, looking at power, looking at oppression. But this is a 32-week curriculum that we implement within the schools. Some of the former program participants are actually now running our workshops. So you have this level of graduated responsibility within our school-based program. Shortly after we started our school-based initiative, we're talking about at least maybe a month or 2 months after, once you have something in place, it's easier for other people to buy into what it is that you're doing. And it's easier to recruit volunteers, it's easier to recruit staff, even if it sucks. And the early days of programming, it sucked. It was okay, but it was a start. And at least you have something to build off of. And so we started our hospital-based intervention program for CAVI, which is looking at making sure that we prevent recidivism, we prevent recurrent violence from occurring. We do case management. We have social workers on our team. We have behavioral health participant staff members on our team to do counseling and therapy. We also have our intervention specialists who do follow-up when the patient is in the emergency department. They also follow the patients up on the inpatient service. We follow the patient upon discharge because we know how important it is to maintain that social support system so that you don't wind up sinking back into some of these days, into some of the trauma that you've experienced before. It might even be something simple like helping you get an ID card so you can get, if you have an ID card, you can maybe even get employment in something, in a place that might be legal, not necessarily doing something under the books. But hospital-based intervention programs that we have are really a part of a growing network of intervention programs around the entire United States, providing a trauma-informed care approach. And trauma-informed care, for people who are familiar, how many people know the trauma-informed care have heard this term before? Okay, there are a few people in here. But trauma-informed care is really a tailored approach to addressing violence and trauma, paying attention to physical injuries that a person has been dealing with. We do an excellent job as emergency physicians, but we also pay equal attention to the psychosocial trauma that a person has experienced. And it really falls under the premise of understanding the nature of the trauma that's taking place and helping the individual and their families and their support system cultivate resiliency and adaptability in ways to process that trauma by building upon the strengths of that individual and that support system that they are part of. Patients who participate have lower recidivism rates after they've been injured, and they're less likely to be convicted of a crime in the future. Trauma-informed care and hospital-based intervention models are really more part of a social ecological model of care, which pays attention to the needs of the individual, their interpersonal relationships, their social support systems, the organizations that they're a part of, the community that they're a part of, but really helping those individuals and looking at also the policies that impact safety and the resources that are required to heal. Now, what's your role as emergency physicians? We're going to do our primary survey, our secondary survey. We're going to make sure our patients are stabilized. We're going to make sure that we keep them alive. But then after that, we want to make sure they don't come back with repeat injuries. And this is especially important for our ED docs when we wind up discharging somebody after a violent trauma. You're going to assess the person whether or not you think they're going to be safe enough. You're going to refer them to intervention programs. For us, it's as simple as going in and putting in a social work consult and put CAVI in there, and our team will wind up going to see them. Any patient who comes in with a violent trauma, put a social work consult in. I don't care if they're 13, 14, 12, 10, 11. If you think that they might need some assistance, if there's an assault, put it in. We let social workers and our team members sort through that stuff later on. CAVI itself really focuses on a lot of the interpersonal violence. Social work, and this is also a way to not piss off social work because they didn't really want us in the hospital. They didn't want people who might have been credible messengers. Some of our staff members are just as impacted. Social work also didn't want us to infringe on their territory because when you're looking at it from an administrative point of view, when you have other people entering your territory, they start looking at funding. It's not about well-being of the patient. They start looking at funding. So if somebody else does this work, that means we don't need to pay them to do this work. And so then if we don't need to pay them to do that work, that means my salary can be wiped out. You're expendable. And so there's a lot of politics when you wind up doing a lot of this community work and even ED work. And we can, Willis is sitting there right now. And he understands the nature of this stuff probably more than any of us in this room, other than Dr. Gernsheimer, who's been dealing with politics and emergency medicine for a few decades. Put in the consult. And last but not least, for a lot of you all, especially who are interested in social change, I want to make sure you advocate for policies and programs tied to violence and trauma. Now, if you don't know what to say and what to ask for, there are a series of screening questions that have been adopted from some of the questions that they used to use at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. First thing is, do you know the person that hurt you? Do you think that the conflict or the incident that took place is over? Do you think your friends or family are going to retaliate? You think this incident is over? Did you report this stuff to the authorities? Do you have a safe place to go after you wind up leaving out of the emergency department? Do you feel comfortable going back to the place where it took place? If you have a person who's been assaulted in front of their apartment building and we're discharging them back to that same apartment building and they live in public housing, people are going to still be hanging out. Do you think that person is going to feel safe to go back? No. You think they're going to wind up being triggered? Of course. You're going to wind up having a prolonged, ongoing response to these having these stress responses, and they're going to wind up coming out with all these other behavioral health issues. It's also very important that when we do screen, remember, we're in a busy emergency department. If we have the opportunity to take somebody behind closed doors and talk to them about some of these questions in private, please do so. When you have somebody who might be in police custody, don't ask about whether or not do they know who this person is. Don't ask, do they know who this person is? Because then people are going to look at you like you're the ops, right? They're going to look at you as somebody who is working with law enforcement, because the only person who's going to ask these kind of questions in front of a cop is going to be law enforcement. You're trying to incriminate me if you ask me all these different questions about the situation. So on the most basic level, just ask, do you feel safe going back home? You might be discharged. Do you feel safe? Nothing else. And then behind closed doors, no law enforcement, you can ask some of those other questions. If you don't remember anything else I tell you today, remember SELF. SELF is an acronym for safety, emotion, loss, and future. This is a part of the sanctuary model, which is looking at violence intervention and the therapeutics that are tied to that. The first thing, when somebody's been injured, their sense of safety has been compromised, right? They've been injured. You got somebody who was 18 years old. They used to be able to run, jump, do whatever. Now all of a sudden they've been shot in the back. They've been shot in the leg. They walk with a limp. They got a neuropathy, and so they're dragging their leg. That means they're going to be an easy target. They can't go back home. Somebody's going to chase them. They can't get away. That's going to set them up for an opportunity to be killed. So you've got to assess that person's safety. Other things, you got to think about the emotional management. We mentioned before, any 20%, the rate of people experiencing PTSD is high amongst people who've been assaulted. Remember when we were in medical school, remember that whole SIGI CAPS thing? Sleep, interest, guilt, energy, concentration, appetite, psychomotor stuff, all that, suicidal ideations. Ask those questions. We talked about those other questions. You have heart palpitation, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling nauseous. Ask them those questions. These are some of the non-physical things that might impact their health and well-being, but these are some of the screening tools that we can use. Pay attention to that. And if they do have some of those symptoms, I recommend referring anybody to behavioral health resources after they've experienced a trauma. Refer them to the R building. Don't say you need to go see a therapist. Say, we're going to send you to a place that's safe, that you can talk to a behavioral health expert to help you talk about some of the traumas. And we have other people around who can help you process that stuff. When you go, I'm going to send you to a psychiatrist, everybody around here, everybody in this room. If I told y'all, even the ones everybody in this room who's seen a psychiatrist before, you'd be like, nah, I ain't crazy. Ain't nothing wrong with me. And you're going to be projecting that. But if you say we're going to send you to a place where there's going to be a support system, they go, okay. It takes on a different connotation. But individuals who've experienced any kind of trauma are going to experience some kind of loss. They're going to experience a loss of a limb, loss of functionality, loss of a way of life that they're used to. And more importantly, what's going to happen to them in the future. And so helping them navigate this space, at least pointing them in the direction of people who have access to these resources, is going to be really important for their overall well-being. A lot of this work doing violence intervention, doing trauma is taxing. It's hard, it's arduous. It's a pain in the ass. This is the hardest work I think I've done outside of being a parent. This is the hardest work I've done outside of doing residency before work hour restrictions. Dr. G knows what I'm talking about. That was a terrible time. But we still do it anyway. And, we always have these things in the back of our mind. Damn, if I had more resources, if I had more money, if I had more time, that could really make a difference in the outcomes of the patients. But that's part of the journey. You got to figure out how to make the time. You got to figure out how to cultivate these resources. That's the work. I want to thank you. I want to welcome. And I think I did something to this and I don't realize what I did, but thank you for having me, and I'll entertain any questions if you